So I'm Dr. Karen Dempsey. I'm a lecturer in later medieval archaeology in Cardiff, and I've been doing a project on this castle for a good few years, and just doing little bits and pieces. And I've got funding from the Castle Studies Trust as well over the years, and so this is kind of coming towards the end of bringing together all these threads. So I'm going to weave together a few things: architecture, history, people, plants, and places, basically. So, but it is also a micro story of the material life of Roesia, because I think really we can tell big stories from small things. And I think it's attending to these very small stories that we can actually understand the past, the kind of more human scale of people, places, and things, as well as the more than human world, which has kind of started to be introduced into my work. In 1236, Roesia de Verdun wrote to King Henry III, to declare that she had built a good castle strongly in her lands against the Irish, which none of her predecessors were able to do. And this is quite the bold statement, but it's also very in keeping with the kind of the language style of the barons at this time. This quote was preserved, and this letter was preserved in the close rolls, which are kind of royal records that were sealed with wax, and typically only read or revealed by the addressee. And this makes it very personal. It's a bold statement sent directly to the king with a wax seal from Roesia's household. But it was a remarkable thing that she did, that she created this castle. It's the only castle in Ireland built by a named female patron in 13th century Ireland. And it's very significant because there's only a few castles that have a similar story. In England, Elizabeth de Burgh built a new chamber at Clare Castle in the mid 1340s. And there's other examples like Countess Richelieu, who built a tower and all the fortifications at the castle of Beaumont and established a chapel in honour of Saint Venant. As Gilbert, from the Chronicle of Hainaut, it's recorded. Earlier in the 10th century, Constance, a daughter of the Count of Arles and the King of Robert the Pious, was considered to have been the patron of the palace at Étampes. And Annie Renaud has outlined other examples of this in her Elite Women, Places and Castles in Northern France, where she explores many things that link women with castles and chambers, something that other people have also talked about. And so today I want to talk about the kind of complex material character of Roesia and her sacred macro and micro landscapes, as well as her own material expression of piety, which includes the curation of particular plants, the creation of chapels, as well as the foundation of religious households. And this is going to take us on a journey from lands near and far to us, so the immediate and wider landscape of Castle Roche, County Louth, its local church at Cain, the Franciscan Friary at Dundalk, which is about 10 kilometres from the castle, and a little bit further across the sea to Leicestershire, the Abbey of Croxton and Gracedieu Priory. We're then going to come back to the castle complex, where there's the possible presence of a garden, which is very exciting, and medicinal plants, plus a private chapel. And this is quite exciting because this allows us to think about the deeper connections, the material connections, including Roesia's use of stone. This will take us back to Castle Roche, to Nina, another castle in the southwest of Ireland, and then back to Gracedieu, her intended final resting place. I want to show you how the material expression of this was entangled with her life and her death, of this one medieval woman who's the center point of my paper. So kind of the castle is actually not the center point of my paper, but Roesia is such an interesting character. It'd be a shame not to center her. So Castle Roche is it's one of these castles, it's amazingly sited on this big rocky outcrop overlooking the flat plains in North County Louth. And it was part of the territorial landholdings of the Verduns. The castle, as you can see, commands this really prominent position in the landscape, and the curtain walls enclose an almost triangular area rising directly from the edge of the bedrock on all but the northeast side, along which is where the gatehouse is located. Situated within this gatehouse, above the gate passage, is a residential chamber, which once likely accessed the aisled hall, which is situated along the southern side of the castle complex. Now, not enough is known about how this space was arranged. It's established that there's a hall, the central space of administration. There's also this really unusual thick-walled square building at the western end of the hall, which was placed centrally within the castle complex. And ideas of its function include a kitchen, a prison, or a well house. Analysis of its ownership and research on the historic fabric of the castle indicated that it was conducted in 3 separate stages. The gatehouse was before the hall, but it's unclear if this was actually the first masonry feature on the site. But what is clear is that this castle seems to have been built to a similar plan that evolved in stages over a short period of time. It's most likely the gatehouse, the hall, and the curtain were certainly constructed and finished under Roesia's patronage during the early to mid 13th century. Sorry, I should have flicked on there. So this is the interior of the medieval hall, and you can see these really large window seats, a little bit articulated in stone. And this is the opposite side of the chamber, looking down a really, really steep slope, and the interior of the gatehouse here. Now, of course, this has underwent some restoration, so not everything you see is as it was. It's obviously also pretty ruined too, you know. So on a large plateau to the east of the castle, and the castle is separated by a wide rock-cut fosse, there's a series of earthworks, and this has always been thought to be indicative of a deserted medieval settlement, which is recorded in historic sources. They tell us that there was a weekly market, an annual fair, and there's a borough here at least by 1332 when it's explicitly mentioned. But the annual fair is mentioned earlier in 1284. However, in about 1330, an inquisition into the lands of Theobald Verdun, Roesia's son, record the castle is actually destroyed. It's been burnt by the Irish and it has no value. But before we get that bad news, we know that there's about 80 acres of land that the burgess of the town of Roche had held there. So we know that the town, its toll booth, and associated lands suggest a settlement potentially much larger than this plateau could actually accommodate. Now, like I was saying, this project comes together with loads of other projects. And so the past couple of years, I've been doing this project on later medieval households in Ireland, specifically focusing on peasant accommodation. And so as part of that and tied into this project, I did some geophysics to try and understand if this settlement was here at the castle on the plateau, and or if there was medieval houses associated with the castle. And so the geophysics I was hoping was going to answer all these questions and, you know, show this great medieval settlement. Well, no, it didn't, unfortunately. It's a total mess because the geology up there is really volcanic. And so we did mag and res over a series of a couple of weeks, myself and a team of others. This was also funded by the Society for Medieval Archaeology and the Royal Irish Academy. There's no foundations, there's no house plots. There's the footing of some large buildings along with an enclosing wall, which is really interesting. There is an enclosing wall that encircles the top of the plateau. And there is also a lot of burning, which kind of relates back to maybe the 1330 description of the settlement not being worth very much at all. So, but the magnetic signal could also come from the kind of underlying geology. So it's not exactly 100% clear what is going on here. The interesting thing is that despite what the historic sources said, there's definitely no church here, at least no expression of what a church of this period may have looked like. So the results are quite complicated. So one thing I was thinking then was maybe the town is located in the flat field that's further east on the northern side of the modern road. You can see it here in these images. And you can see Kieran is in one of those images there, Kieran O'Connor, who helped me do some of this work. There's a possible windmill mound, which is part of the kind of material landscape of Roesia's castle. There's an undated platform here and a possible house or building, but there's still a missing town and all the things that go with that, including a missing church. And I think I probably need to think about, in terms of the material expression of Roesia's landscape, maybe was there ever a church associated with the castle? Would there have been one for the townspeople or the castle workers? So there's a couple of contenders for this. There is definitely not a church now in the parish of Roche. But in 1658, an inquisition concerning the parishes of County Louth noted that a church at Roche was out of repair and had no ministers. So there definitely was one once upon a time. No above grounds remains of this, and no place name evidence indicates a church at Roche. But two adjacent townlands, Edenkill and Cain, do actually retain evidence. Edenkill, or Eidon Kial, the church of the brow of the hill. There's no remains of a church there, but Kill is typically associated with churches from the earlier medieval period. But I think we can kind of discount that because it's from the earlier medieval period. Lots of associated townlands have that name, and it doesn't really fit here. And also Cain is better suited for my story, so we're using that today. So we have a little look at the Church of Cain, and because I think this is a really good contender for the church that's associated with the castle. There is the remains of later medieval church, and there's simple grave markers, as you can see here. It's also intervisible with the castle. It's only 1.5 kilometers southeast. It's also present in the historic sources from about 1297, when it's mentioned in the plea rolls. And most convincing, perhaps, is the mention of the church of Ad Ken, which Roesia de Verdun appointed William, son of the miller, as a parson. And I think perhaps more interestingly here is that this appointment included both to the church of Ad Ken and the chapel of Roche or Derup. So this might mean that we are actually missing a church building at Roche, or it could mean that there's a previously unidentified chapel within the castle complex, which I mentioned was kind of underexplored. And I know in Ireland that the term chapel kind of is used quite interchangeably, and it can mean any church that's not a parish church, but it also can apply to chapels within castles. But the interesting thing here to remember is that there's a spatial, material, and historical connection between Cain and Roche, the pastor at Cain, an unknown chapel at Roche, and between the patron and the castle and the church in the adjacent townland. So if we have a previously unidentified chapel at Roche, we know that chapel and castle tend to go together, especially in castles of this standing. Where is it? Well, there is no obvious church building in Roche. But what about a chapel in the castle? Okay, so chapels are not very, very common in castles, but they do survive. Chapels and castles of this period are often located close to or above the entrance. And, this had multiple meanings, but it was understood to bestow a kind of protective or caring function for those coming and going from the household, but also perhaps a watchful eye for those coming and going who weren't known as so well. At Trim, which is a castle close-ish to Roche now, but it's different. It's interesting because the de Lacy family are really entangled with the de Verduns. The chapel here is positioned in the east-facing second floor room above the main entrance. Similarly, ish dated is also the chapel at Maynooth, and it's located in the first floor space of the fore building. And okay, these are two really, really high status castles, but we see this kind of pattern again and again. At Grennan, the chapel is over the main entrance. At Lee Castle, closer in date, the chapel is in the north-facing tower beside the main entrance. And so I think we need to take a closer look at Castle Roche, and maybe there's something there that we can see that hadn't been looked at before. I think it's possible that there's a previously unidentified chapel at first floor level in the eastern tower of the gatehouse. Above or adjacent to the main entrance, there's a chamber with an east-facing window. The arched embrasure is plank-centered, and usually this is indicative of a 12th to 13th century date. Red stone here once surrounded the opening, and it is quite robbed out now, but it's still very obvious. On the south side of this chamber, located in the wall, are the remains of a small square aperture. it too would have been once surrounded by red sandstone. And I'm starting to think, and I mean, I'm convinced that this might be a piscina, a stone basin near the altar in a Catholic and pre-Reformation church for draining water used in the Mass. If so, this altar potentially faced east through the window, and it was also surrounded by sandstone. And maybe this is the castle chapel, the chapel that Roesia appointed the parson to, that is mentioned in historic sources, but that has been previously unidentified. So having this chapel and the source material to accompany it, I'm very excited by it. And I think, this is evidence-based speculation that the residents of the castle, or at least some of them, might have used this small chapel, which may have been attended by a local parson, William, son of Richard the Miller. So while exciting and everything, it's not that surprising to find chapels in castles of this standing. But I think what I'm really interested in here is the context. Who is trying to say what and why? We know that medieval people understood that materials had a particular potency and that it embodied particular meanings. And I want to know, why is this red stone here? This chapel was built around the time Roesia was boasting about finally doing what her predecessors could not, okay? In the entire castle complex, this red sandstone only occurs in 2 locations. Here in the chapel, but also on the surrounds of a small ope in the adjacent tower, but literally nowhere else does it survive. And I know you're probably going to say, oh, Karen, this is because this type of stone does not survive very well. But actually, other stone does survive well in the castle. We have grey wacky and possible other pink granite, light pink granite. So there's been a very, very deliberate choice in this material. It's used at one space in the castle, and it has to be linked in some way to material piety. So where else do we find this stone? And what are the events that surround this story so that we can better understand this chapel, or how it was demarcated at Castle Roche? So here we're going to turn to the immediate life of Roesia, the patron, and her wider network she was involved with. She was a noblewoman whose family was established in Ireland from shortly before the arrival of the Anglo-Normans. And Roesia eventually inherited these lands from her father in 1231. Bertram de Verdun was Roesia's grandfather, and it seems likely she was named after his second wife, Roese, Nicholas's mother. Now, like many noble women, we don't know much about Roesia's early life, but we do know that by 1225, she had married, possibly for the second time. And it's interesting here because King Henry made a special request for this marriage to Theobald Butler. First, he wrote to her father asking him to encourage her to marry him. And when he didn't seem to have a satisfactory response or any action on that, he wrote directly to her. Now, I'd like to say, she flouted the rules of the king, but no, she definitely did not. She did marry Theobald Butler, and he was heir to the Ormond lands in Munster, so huge landholding in southwest Ireland. But she retained her maiden name. And they had 4 children, and each successive year from 1225 until the death of her husband, she had a child. Now, her husband died in Henry III's campaign in 1230 in Poitiers. And after her death, basically, please marry Theobald. But after her death, Roesia was a very, very rich widow. She had her father's estates. She also had some of her dower that she retained from her marriage to Theobald. And she very, very quickly made sure that she would not have to remarry again. So she paid a large tax so that she wouldn't have to do this. And so over the course of the next decade or so, Roesia went on a building and sponsorship campaign. She founded Gracedieu Priory, an independent Augustinian priory near Tringstone in Leicestershire. Okay, so not so much is known about the history of Gracedieu, although it is certain that the house was built between 1231 and 1241. And this charter was confirmed by Bishop Grosseteste, and 2 documents still survive from that. And one has a seal that was belonging to Roesia, and it's still attached. So Roesia continued the traditions of donation to Croxton Abbey by her grandfather, and which is also the location of his burial and that of her own father. In 1246, Roesia also founded a Franciscan friary in Dundalk. And now only a little bit of this remains. So, it's only a little bit of the 13th century tower that you can see here. Roesia, like most and many noble women, created and maintained connections with religious houses, as well as finding space for the provisions of chapels within their castles. So kind of coming back to my original question about this link between red sandstone and material expression of piety or power. At Croxton, the red sandstone is the construction stone. Okay, and that's not surprising given its location, but Croxton was the family mausoleum. Her father and grandfather were buried there. Red sandstone is also part of a surviving piece of the friary at Dundalk that she founded. There's some sandstone coins surrounding on the tower. We've seen the red sandstone at Castle Roach, that only some particular spaces were articulated with this red sandstone. But unfortunately at Roesia, there's none. But it might be easier to say that none survive because it was actually pulled down in the 17th century. So where else do we find this stone? Well, one place deserves a little bit further consideration. So I mentioned that Roesia married one of the butlers, and Nina Castle was the caput of his estate. This castle is very different to Castle Roach in a way. It comprises a circular stone tower, a now lost curtain, but also a twin-towered gatehouse. Nina was remodelled in the early to mid-13th century, and a lavish space was constructed in the gate tower at first floor level. There is a chapel in the window embrasure at the top of Nina Castle, and there appears to be red sandstone used at important points here to potentially articulate particular spaces, but also power and authority, and perhaps also a sort of personal piety. So there may be some direct material connections to its uses in these spaces. And somewhat tantalizingly, during excavation, dozens of decorated stone fragments were found. One central boss of sandstone, potentially red, has a rose carved in it. But as much as I really want these dates to fit, they don't. They don't exactly fit. The remodel was probably likely mid to late 13th century. And of course, by that time, Roesia was dead. So there haven't been any comprehensive studies of where red sandstone occurs in other places in Ireland. We know that it was used in Dublin Castle in door jambs. It can be seen in the door jambs of the postern close to the Undercroft, which is in the north curtain wall beside the Powder Tower. But what I think is going on here is that there's a widespread connection to how sacred spaces were articulated, and red sandstone, regardless of how common it was a material of choice for this. And Roesia was a very, very determined person when it came to how she crafted and embodied her own identity, especially in relation to how she curated the church with her own spiritual and devotional practices. So I think rather than trying to shoehorn red sandstone into anything, I think we should see it as it being a design and choice that she participated with, and perhaps it's an idea of why to use particular types of stones for reasons relating to some sort of material potency. So I've shown you some of the sacred spaces that were entangled with the life of Roesia, and with Castle Roach kind of being the center point of this paper. But while I wanted to talk about her life, we also have to think about her death. I began by talking about how we might explore Roesia as one of the only named 13th century women who was patron of a castle. But there's actually one other remarkable thing about her life. It's her effigy. Her tomb also survives, and it's one of only 2 tombs of women who founded medieval religious houses in the early part of the 13th century. In her foundation of Grace Dieu, she was to be buried in the church. She chose not to be buried with her father and grandfather at the family mausoleum. Her grandson, Theobald de Verdun, also desired to be buried in the Church of the Nuns of the Holy Trinity of the Grace of God, although in any event, he died in 1309 and he was actually interred in Croxton as well. So I don't know what that says about not honouring the wishes of the dead, but anyway. I could talk about many things here about presentations of material piety, her relationship to the church from the seal of the Gratio, which pictures Roesia kneeling down, which is potentially below Christ, but also it could be understood as kneeling below Bishop Grosseteste, who assisted in her foundation and co-signed her charter. Roesia in this image, as the founder, holds aloft the charter. Her role as patron, if it was not only clear from the donation, the charter and the seal, is further demonstrated by the quality and design of her tomb, originally in the Priory Church, but after the Reformation, it was moved and actually then was found in Belton Church in the parish church there. So her tomb is quite complex. It comprises a 6-foot female effigy between two side shafts with moulded capitals, which in turn support a canopy with heraldic devices in the spandrels. At the top and bottom are 2 panels, but these underwent alterations in the 20th century, potentially to fix the damage caused during the Reformation. And you can kind of see that they haven't been super sympathetically restored. Presumably one of the figures there is supposed to be Roesia's soul going to heaven, and perhaps the others are nuns praying for Roesia's soul. But there are other things to note too, because there's a difference between the actual restoration of the tomb and the 18th or 19th century drawings, where in one she has a necklace with a lamp and also a book, which actually don't feature in the later restoration. And these symbols are really important. The lamp is the burning light, which was also present on another seal of Roesia. And the book in her arm, in her effigy, may well be a psalter, which is a personal prayer book. And this would tie her into really well-established networks of generations of book-owning women. And of course, there's also a rose in the top right-hand corner. It's speculative, but there's a rosette in the central bosset Nina. Rose is her own name and her paternal grandmother's name. And Rose was also part of the symbolism around the Virgin. But I have another part to add to this puzzle, thinking about the material expression of this one woman's identity. And here we're going to come back to the geophysical survey, which was kind of making a laugh of earlier, but actually there's something very interesting about what is going on. So one idea is that it might be a garden or parts of a garden. So historic sources record the presence of a borough alongside a weekly market that I mentioned earlier. There's an annual fair and there's a toll booth at Roche. So you're talking about something that's quite significant. An inquisition of the lands of Theobald Verdun also recorded a small plot or called park, and a garden lying around the castle, and 4 acres of meadow and a pasture around the castle. So I went back to the original Latin transcription, and it uses the term gardinia, which was used to imply a plural. And so it could actually mean, the correct translation would be gardens lying around the castle. So there is, and Rachel Swallow has argued a similar thing recently about the term gardinia, and so I kind of drew on that to sort of build up this idea of gardens at the castle. There is potential, given all of the high status elements in this landscape, of a gardinium at Castle Roche, and it might refer to a more ornate garden commensurate with Roesia's own place in the social elite of the later medieval period. Interestingly, gardens aren't that well researched in castle studies, and perhaps that's because they don't fit neatly into narratives of war or power. There are, in the geophysical results, okay, and they're not super well processed, or no, they are well processed, but just not really well annotated here. There are significant areas of burning. There were significant areas of burning within the walled area on the plateau, as well as the robbed out foundation trenches of only 2 large buildings. Previously, earthworks on the plateau have been understood as indicative of the medieval ville, However, the results of the wider geophysical survey don't seem to indicate this pattern. And actually, the space is a very, very tight up there when you think about it being a walled enclosed space too. So I was thinking then, if there, like I said earlier, the potential for the settlement to be located across the road, given there's a house platform there, a potential windmill, it's on a flat landscape, it seems to be a little bit more promising. So I'm like, what was this plateau used for? Is it possible that this plateau was actually some of the gardens that would have been typically associated with a castle of this status? So here we have sort of similar castle gardens at Stafford Castle, and that kind of Ollie Creighton sent this to me when we talked about this before, and so it kind of seems that the geophysics might actually be revealing of something more similar to this rather than a medieval settlement. To add a few more layers to this story, oh sorry, I've skipped on a few slides there. So to add a few more layers to this story, and this is where I'm bringing in the funding from the Castle Studies Trust, I teamed up with a botanist, Dr. Fiona McGowan, to investigate relict plants at medieval castles. And this is, some of these, I believe, these relic plants are botanical presents revealed that it were botanical samples that were introduced by communities arriving into Ireland during the 12th and 13th centuries, who were bringing new medicinal knowledge and medieval pharmacological practices with them that were beginning to circulate, as Monica Green has argued, around Europe at this time. And so at Castle Roach, we identified 3 archaeophytes. So relict plants are plants that are non-native or rare to that particular location, but survive at castle sites and are absent from suitable surrounding terrain. So this makes them kind of markers for medicinal or culinary or agricultural practices. And at Castle Roach, we identified 3 archaeophytes. And archaeophytes are very particular non-native plants introduced pre-1500 into Ireland and Britain. And these had well-known medicinal properties. We've hemlock, common mallow, and milk thistle. And so this also suggests, given their absence from suitable surrounding terrain, that there may actually have been a resident population who were interested in gardening and concerned with growing medicinal plants. And milk thistle here is particularly interesting. It is non-native and it is still rare in present-day Ireland. So its survival here is really remarkable. And it has survived here for, it's been noted as long as people have started taking botanical samples, it has been noted as a surviving stand here. The plant itself has been scientifically proven to increase liver regeneration, to reduce blood cholesterol, and to help prevent cancer. Interestingly, it also has a lactogenic effect, which means it increases milk production. So in the grand, so you can see here the samples, even today in modern day, in present day Britain and Ireland, it is quite a rare plant. And that's why I'm going to focus in on it here. So it's widely in the Great Herbal, which is, or the Grand Herbier, it's a widely reproduced medicinal manuscript, circa around 1525. And milk thistle here is believed to increase the flow of mother's milk, aid the creation of children within the womb, and help women nourish their children. And we think about Roesia, her second marriage, potentially her second marriage, 4 children in a period of 5 years. Master John Gardner was one of the first to write a garden book in England, and lists a number of suitable plants for a garden. And this also includes milk thistle. The plant is also really important symbolically, because it appears in the imagery of the unicorn in the captivity as part of the unicorn tapestries. And I'm not saying this is directly related to Roesia, but this is a really iconic series of textiles constructed in the Low Countries in the 15th century. It's embedded with a series of religious imagery, as well as symbolism related to marriage and fertility. And you can see that milk thistle is also present here. So I think it's very possible that these plants could have been used by Roesia as part of the care and maintenance of her young family, as a way to kind of indicate her knowledge of medicinal practice, her international garden style, and awareness of religious iconography. And whatever we can argue about its uses at Castle Roche, there is potential for this plant to have fulfilled many roles, from symbolic to ornamental to culinary and medicinal, things that Roesia, an elite medieval woman, was very likely aware of. The good example too, of course, is that religious iconography related to plants were also included on her tomb with the rose. This ornamentation also includes rose detailed on it. The rose was, of course, not only her name, but also embedded in Christian cosmology and practice. Roses were gifted at the feast of St. John the Baptist, but also wrapped up in the cult of the Virgin. Rose water was seen as medicine. So the whole range of things that are going on here. I think we can also perhaps include this other addition to her sacred landscape, the use of red sandstone, which is also linked to rose through its colour. And colour was a very important thing in the medieval period. Things were given a particular material potency related directly to colour. So from weaving together all these different stories, we've identified the chapel, well, you know, fingers crossed, at Castle Roche, the possible parish church of Roche at Caen. And I think that is a really, really exciting thing to have come from this project, because we have to start thinking, you know, we're bringing in the wider landscape here and the kind of historical connections that have been underplayed, perhaps, of Roesia's wide-reaching power in this particular place in North County Louth. I've drawn links between the use of red sandstone to deliberately create these material connections to other castles and religious houses to show just how networked Roesia was in Ireland and Britain. Networked with architecture, historical connections with other nobles, but also this shared ideology surrounding material piety and its expression in architecture. By examining the final resting place of Roesia in her own carefully designed tomb in the church that she founded at Grace Dieu, it's possible to see how sacred spaces of church, castle, chapel all come together and are used in this communication, transmission, and embodiment of particular ideals. And this kind of showing this very particular, carefully crafted identity in the life and death of one noblewoman. And we see this also in the kind of maybe the use of the sacred plant Silubum Marianum, but related back to Mary, Fadacon Mura in Irish, related back to Mary, St. Mary's thistle, milk thistle. So she's not only reacting or participating in this network, but also drawing in these other kind of human-plant relations, this direct relationship to this green environment and the potential garden, of course, at Castle Roche. So we're seeing this transmission and embodiment of particular ideals, a carefully crafted identity in the life and death of this noblewoman who was part and participative of the wider devotional sponsorship networks that we see across Europe at this time, and indicative of her class. And of course, part of this too is garden culture. And so I think the material piety, whether genuine or affected, I'm not trying to make her out as this complete woman who's very devotional, but also just to know, to acknowledge that she's part of this wider network. And this is very genuinely visible in her life and death, from Castle Roche to Grace Dieu. Okay, thank you.